give a crap about what anybody says. And it makes you work harder. So I had that with somebody I was working with. And then when I had to cover teams, Tony Lewis was terrific. He took me, and I thought everyone was going to be like him. He took me to all the security guards and said, look, she's got a credential, she's fine. I thought it'd be, oh, this is a piece of cake. Once he left, then I realized it wasn't like that. When I went up to the Bears to cover, they sent me up to cover their Wednesday, Thursday open locker room. No woman had ever walked in that locker room. I didn't know that. So I go in there. This is with the 80s, the championship team. I go in there, and the players are screaming obscenities, saying things you wouldn't say to anybody. And it wasn't so bad. It was bad that they did it. It was worse watching my peers snicker and think it was wonderful that I was being treated like that. And the head of the PR department says, you have to leave. So I used to have to sit outside for Bears coverage, and players used to come to me. And it took years until Jim Harbaugh was brought out to talk to me, and he says, why is she sitting out there? And I laughed because it took a player, not my boss, not my peers. It took a player that said she should be in there. Because I was allowed to do after games. Games was a different story, but the practices, they wouldn't let me do it until then. And so when Jim Harbaugh was in the Super Bowl, I was so happy for him. A lot of people don't like him because he's a crazy man, but he's my angel.
And what year was that? So they know that he said that to you.
It was the 80s.
But it's just that it's not like
No,
that
I mean,
far back
yeah,
history in a way.
no, I mean, but there's so many. There was a lot of wonderful people along the way that you had to find, but there were players. I mean, I had one time a player, and I found humor was always a great way to unmask somebody. There was a time when I had been in the Boston Celtics locker room, and there was a very tall player with red hair who decided to dance with his towel, you know, in front of me with no clothes on. And I said, oh, what a jerk. So when he sat down, I walked by, I said, you know, there really isn't much to look at now, is there? It worked. To me, that you have to find a way, you know, at that time, because no one was going to fight for me. I had to do it myself. I didn't want to get into a battle. So to me, it was humor. That was the way I always handled it.
I think a lot of us, too, try to blend in, and I'd be curious if you guys felt that way, that, you know, some women, now Lisa Olson, and I know Lisa very well, but, you know, she took a stand, and at that time, I have to say,
that was
I was
in the
supportive.
mid-'80s, right?
It
I was
was,
just going to ask, because I think it was when I was in high school.
Yeah, I was working at the time, yeah.
Was it mid-'80s?
Yeah,
Maybe you should, are you going to tell the
should
story?
know that. Well, the story was told in the documentary,
Oh, it
right,
was?
about the New England Patriots. Yeah, was it told completely, sufficiently? Just real fast, I mean, she was a reporter for the Boston Herald.
Yeah.
And was in the post-game locker room with the Patriots. I can't
No,
remember
it
the
was
guy's
a
name.
post-game. It was actually during
Was it practice?
It was practice.
Now I'm blanking on the guy's name.
Zeke Mowat.
Zeke Mowat.
Okay.
And, yeah, because when that happened, I was covering the Bears at the time, and I was,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, I was being followed by media.
Right, yeah. He fondled himself in front of Lisa. Lisa rightfully took it to her boss. I don't think she wanted to make a big deal out of it at all. In fact, I know she didn't. But somehow it ended up in a column, in a notes column, in either her paper or the Herald. I believe it was the Herald, or the Globe, rather. Had a little note that there was a problem. It became bigger and bigger. It snowballed, and to the point where, yes, there was a certain amount of support from her editors, but the fans were just, you know, absolutely merciless, throwing things at her, screaming at her, to the point where
Did she go into hiding?
she went to Australia.
She worked in Australia,
to work. That's how badly she felt like she couldn't work in the U.S. anymore, which is crazy.
And now she's back with the Globe, right?
Right. So it's interesting. And she's a very gifted writer and stuff. I remember, though, at the time, because I had gone through a few things and tried my best to keep it very quiet. Joan Ryan is a wonderful writer. She was at the San Francisco Examiner for many, many years. She may still be with them. And she and I had gone through something with the USFL locker room. We all kind of was like an unspoken thing that you just tried to shut up and keep it
Just do your job.
quiet. You know, do your job. We wanted to blend in. We didn't want people to resent that we were there. Nobody wants to hear about, we're not the story. You know, we've always been trained that way.
Yes.
Journalists are not the story, and that's why I think it made us all women a little uncomfortable when Lisa's thing happened. She became the story. No one wanted to sympathize. People picked more on all of us because of Lisa Olson. So I feel badly, because I'm not sure how supportive I was at the time, you know, outwardly. I didn't publicly say anything, but I probably could have been more outwardly supportive of her. Whenever there were stories about women, I always thought, ugh, just shut up, you know, do your thing. There was a woman at the Daily Iowan when I was at the University of Iowa whose byline was H. Forrest Wooler. For a couple years, I thought she was a guy. And then I realized she was a woman, and I thought, well, okay. And I soon came to learn that she had that byline because she didn't want anyone to know she was a woman. And at that point, you know, I thought, like, wow, is that how it's going to be? We have to, like, hide? But I think it did influence me in maybe somewhat of a bad way, that we did have to be one of the guys to the point where we couldn't stand up. And over the years, I think, you know, we all probably have learned that whatever you bring to the table, whether it's you're a woman, whatever it is, that can be very valuable. And you
Very much
use that.
because
You
I use it a lot because I found that men never, they don't, when they used to call up a player, they would be really abrupt with the wife that answered the phone.
Yeah.
And what I learned was always write down the wife's name, if they had children, and when I would call up, I'd say, you know, I would know their name, I'd ask about their children, and it's amazing how that just opens up a lot of doors. It really does. Because they're, you know, it's a nicer way of dealing. Men never do that.
How have you guys dealt with that, either men athletes thinking you're after them, or women being, you know, maybe a little bit threatened by you guys?
I think the one thing I was going to say was that the Lisa Olson incident kind of influenced me before I was even in the business, because it had me thinking even beforehand that it could be defining how you handle yourself. And she wasn't doing anything wrong, but it put me through the early, how would I have handled that? And I think I was in high school at that time, because it already had me thinking towards it. And it also had me thinking how sad it was that eventually she probably, and now as I see it now, you know, probably it being in the paper made it look like she was making a bigger stink about it, even though it wasn't acceptable. It should have been handled quietly. And I think it's unfortunate that, you know, it probably took on a life of its own that even she didn't want, and, you know, derailed her career, probably her life for a long time. But, yeah, I think the thing about, you know, handling the wives who glare at you when you're walking into the clubhouse or, you know, whatever is, like Cheryl said, I think first of all, the first time I went into a locker room was football. It was the Lions, and I was an intern in that first job. And literally, it was the guy who was at the University of Michigan who shoved me in there, and he was like, hey, quarterbacks and receivers are over here, offensive linemen are here, defensive, and it was like, I mean, and they can all attest to the fact you walk in a football locker room, and man, it is nuts. It is like, it's not like you've got, you know, 10 to 20 guys, you've got 50 plus, and it's crazy. And I learned right away that I needed a pen and a piece of paper.
And a big pad.
And something to write on, and something else to just, you don't want anyone to know that you're, even remotely think you're looking at them. And the humor is a great thing. I have not had, fortunately, the experiences they have. Mine have been very minor, and I'm a very sarcastic person, and at the slightest drop of anything questionable, you know, the remarks, that's the way I treat everyone in my life. I was quick at the funny remarks, and I didn't care if it was in front of someone else, because I wanted them to know right away I was not in there for that. The wives is another thing. I would make sure that I tried to smile, and if there was a player there and they were with their wives, I would come over and introduce myself. And, you know, when you ask about their families and let them know that, you know, it's okay to be friendly with them without being, it does, and it opens them up a little bit and relaxes them. You know, even before an interview, whether it's a veteran or not, you know, we joke about something, it relaxes everything. So there were a number of modes that I would employ. The humor was one, and yes, to learn a little bit about their family and to definitely make sure their wives, you know, knew that you were not after their husbands or the girlfriends. You're still going to get the stares and everything else, and people who think you're in there for one reason. But yeah, that's
I think players have actually evolved a lot.
I
So
agree.
to the point,
Depends on the sport.
yeah,
That's true.
but they're used to seeing women in a locker. It's not like, oh my God,
Right.
there's a woman. Like, what are we gonna do? You know, I think they're used to it. They know it's coming. It would get old every day to like. I think nowadays every woman that comes in
Right.
here harassed. There's not a lot, but I think a lot of times it's other media members who are worse about it.
Yes.
And fans definitely don't understand. Like when I tell people what I do, I think probably a lot of you can relate. One of the first questions I get is, like, do you go in the locker room?
Yes.
Oh, what's that like? Are you looking at them? Like, looking at certain areas of them?
Do you say yes?
I mean, seriously. I'm like,
Yes, I do. Yes,
yeah,
I
yeah,
do.
there's
I
like,
take pictures and I
Yeah,
got
right.
my smartphone going.
I mean, and when I was in Philadelphia and covering the Eagles, this guy goes on this sports radio guy who's he's all about shock value, but still he went on the radio and said, these women in there are all looking, all these women, and I'm like, there are 3 of us who cover the Eagles, so you're naming me basically and saying that I look at these guys. So I called him out on it, but he wasn't going to change really, and I think Jason Whitlock's the guy who wrote about women shouldn't be in there. I really think players, for the most part now, don't really care and are used to it.
Well,
Do you think
it's
it's part of
the-
their
the
training?
The Bears still have some issues because it was just a year ago that Lance Briggs brought it up and was
Yeah.
really sarcastic because of what happened with the Spanish-speaking.
Right.
I just won't let our guard down, something
Mhm.
happens, or a woman unfortunately
Right.
will like her
It comes
behave.
up again, and then when it comes up in the media, yeah, and I think.
But I don't think they want anybody in the locker room, to actually be honest
That's
with you. I don't
true.
think they
Right,
want men
I
or
agree.
women in the locker room
Yeah.
because they look at it as
Their
that's
haven
their
and-
place, that's where they can do what they want to do.
Wasn't there a vote shortly after the Lisa Olson incident about, and maybe it's happened several times since, about whether players wanted to be interviewed coming off the field or whether they wanted that 10-minute
Mhm.
period, where it would either be like everyone was out and you were talking to them as they were
Yeah.
coming off. Does anyone remember this?
Well,
I thought this has happened a few times and they voted against it. They
Well,
voted for the
unfortunately,
cool-down
we
period.
don't care what they say, but, no, I mean, really, it's been discussed a million times, let's keep everyone out of the locker room. Because really, the irony of this is that no one's, to imply that women are in the locker room for
any other reason than.
for any other reason than our job, it's to also imply that men are also in there for another reason, or sneaking peeks, or whatever, you know what I'm saying? It's really,
But there
sort
have
of
been women
impugning
that
all
have
of
done
us.
that, though. I mean,
That's the sad
There
part.
was a young lady that was in the business a while ago, and she walked in with sunglasses on and a very slinky top, and I went, oh my God. And sure enough, the players were going crazy, and I had to pull her aside and said, look, you cannot do that. I said, you cannot go in with sunglasses because they're assuming you're looking at them.
I've been in situations in Chicago where they tried the whole media room thing. Where forget the locker room, we'll bring everyone all dressed, showered, combed, whatever, into this media room, and then, that'll be great. Oh, wonderful. Number one, most of them leave, okay? No one's policing that. And then second of all, the ones that come in, as I explain to journalism students all the time, and it's why we interview people, because you want their fresh emotions.
Yes.
You want
Yeah.
them in the way, you don't want to ask a quarterback who fumbled and lost the game for his team, an hour later, after he's taken a shower and cooled down and everything else and gotten all dressed, it's a whole different thing.
Even just the
That's-
setting, like guys at
absolutely.
their locker room are so much more open. I mean, they will tell you anything almost.
Yeah.
But if they're sitting up here like this, it's just cliche after cliche after cliche.
Well,
You go right to the locker room.
Because
it's-
this is like
yeah.
it's like a block, it's like.
And a lot of times their
yeah.
coach is sitting right there next to
Exactly.
them, and they realize it's formal. So
Well, if you cover the Bears, you get the coach speech all the time from the players
Mhm.
because, right? You go in the locker room, they've had enough time where the coach tells them what to say, and then they just repeat
Yeah.
what the coach says. You go, oh, well, you're not getting much anyway.
I'd be curious, Lauren and Meghan, have you had your first, walk into the locker room the very first time, if it was scary, and if not, if you were nervous at all getting into the profession, thinking this isn't a place for women, or, like you said, it's not a big deal anymore because all these guys have seen us around for so long?
I feel like I was more nervous than they were. Like you said, they're more comfortable in the locker room. Like, they just started stripping down. I went with a guy rather than Peggy for my first time going into the locker room. And he was like, this is really awkward. Usually Peggy gives a speech about the first time when you're a woman going in the locker room. And I was like, it's okay. And he said the best advice she's ever given is always look up, not down. When in doubt, up, not down. And I was like, okay. And I feel like they were so much more comfortable than I was. I feel like the only thing that gets uncomfortable is that I'm younger, so they just kind of assume I haven't been in the business long. You know, they're closer to my age, but I feel like sometimes when you're professional, you can still use that to your advantage and relate to them, get to them, you know, feel
When
better.
you're their mothers